So summers at UUI are often a time when we return to the core values and stories of our tradition to reground ourselves, a kind of UU 101 to prepare us for the new church year. And this summer has been no exception. When you talk about our tradition, of course, you're really talking about several traditions, because Unitarian Universalism was formed by the coming together of two distinct, vital, creative, heretical, and by the mid-20th century, very small American religious traditions, Unitarianism and Universalism. It is sometimes said that our Unitarian tradition was characterized by a commitment to reason, freedom, and tolerance, and our Universalist tradition was characterized by the values of faith, hope, and love. In July, we looked at the Unitarian side, freedom, reason, and tolerance, and now in August, we are looking at the Universalist side, faith, hope, and love. What did these words mean to our Universalist forebears, and what might they mean to Unitarian Universalists today? This Sunday, we're talking about the last of these, love. Most of the material for this sermon you can find in a book called The Larger Faith, A Short History of Universalism by Charles Howe, which is a very readable introduction to our Universalist history if you want to dive a little deeper. And in our first two sermons about Universalism, we noted how the Universalist Church in America was started as a Christian movement on fire with a simple message: that God was a God of love, that all people would ultimately be reunited with God in heaven. Humanity's story ends in love. That is the destiny that awaits all of us. And those early Universalists believed that this message was so hopeful and so uplifting that, coupled with Jesus' teachings about loving our neighbor, it could not help but transform the world into a place of peace and harmony. Once we truly understood that love and happiness is assured to us by God, it was felt. In gratitude and in imitation, we would surely seek to spread that love to one another in our daily human lives. And so sharing this hopeful message was the mission of our Universalist ancestors, and this mission created a vibrant, energetic, rapidly expanding religious movement. We then talked about how, by the turn of the 20th century, Universalism had fallen into a malaise. In some ways, it was a victim of its own success. The threat of hell was no longer the emotional centerpiece of mainline Protestant Christian teaching, and it held relatively little sway over the public imagination. Universalism could no longer claim to be the liberating tradition that it once was. As such, it was suffering from an identity crisis. Some Universalists wondered if their work was basically done. Was there any reason left for them to exist as a separate denomination? For this reason, and for some more pedestrian reasons involving demographic changes and not the best organizational practices, the number of Universalist congregations and congregants was in steep decline in the early 20th century. Its energy as a movement was flagging, and Universalism was casting about for a reason to be. In response to this crisis, a critic complained, "You Universalists have squatted on the biggest word in the English language. Either improve the property or move off the premises." And for the next several decades, the Universalists took this criticism to heart. There were three different solutions that emerged within Universalism in the 20th century in an attempt to revitalize the faith. And the first solution was a back-to-basics conservative movement that stressed the specifically Christian, specifically Bible-based identity of Universalism. These traditional Universalists wanted to hear a clear theological identity. They didn't want to be like those loosey-goosey Unitarians where anything goes. And that identity was God, Jesus, and the Bible. And the end goal of this approach was to rejoin mainstream American Christian, the mainstream American Christian church. And the problem was the mainstream American Christian church didn't want anything to do with the Universalists because we were heretics, after all. And so the Universalists were repeatedly rejected and rebuffed in their attempts to join up with the regular Christians. And after a while, they gave up. So the second attempted solution was to embrace the humanist identity that centered the social gospel movement. And this approach retained a liberal Christian identity, but its language became much more metaphorical, right? Universalism became a religion not about heaven somewhere in the hereafter, but about creating heaven on earth, largely through human effort and through human institutions. And so God kind of recedes into the background, less as an active agent and more as kind of a universal spirit of love that grounds this enterprise and gives us hope that it will ultimately succeed. This approach had a lot of energy between the two world wars. It was very interested in social reform and in institutions of social cooperation like the United Nations. It put its hope in a one-world vision of peace and harmony that still resonates in Unitarian Universalism today. And this movement revitalized Universalism for a time, but it was also on the whole far too radical a break with tradition for most Universalist churches to really embrace. And finally, towards the end of Universalism's life as an independent denomination, there was a truly radical movement that sought to reimagine Universalism as a post-Christian religion that draws on wisdom from all of the world's religions, as well as the teachings of science, arts, and the humanities, in order to create a tradition large enough to contain everyone. Maybe that sounds familiar to you. Universalism, by its very nature, it was claimed, cannot be exclusive, cannot be partial, cannot be merely Christian. A truly universal religion must be big enough for all of humanity, a religion for one world. As such, Universalism, while not denying its Christian roots, it was said, must draw in the truths of the world's religions on an equal basis. And critics warned that, creating a world religion was easier said than done. And this kind of pick and choose eclecticism, well, it had some risks and it could lead to shallowness. But these new Universalist leaders believed they could uncover sort of a unifying religious truth that lay behind the world's religious diversity. They looked to things like the Golden Rule. The epitome of this approach was a church founded in 1940s in Boston called the Charles Street Meeting House. Its minister, the Reverend Ken Patton, commissioned this gigantic mural of the Andromeda Galaxy to be like the visual centerpiece of the sanctuary. You go in and it looks like something out of Star Trek. It's just like space. He then gathered 65 symbols or more representing all of the world's religions that were displayed all around the sanctuary. A bookshelf contained all of the world's holy books. And the liturgy of the church service drew on readings and imagery from Scripture all around the world, as well as art and poetry. Patton himself was both a humanist and a mystic, and he created a very human-centered religion grounded in nature and our experience of transcendent mystery of life that inspires awe, wonder, and reverence. And this was a very short-lived experiment. The meeting house never had that many members. It closed in the 1970s, but it was hugely impactful for Unitarian Universalism. Ken Patton's writings and readings are all over our gray hymnal. Our understanding of ourselves as a tradition that draws on the wisdom of all the world's religions is a basic part of who we are today, even if we would never claim to have discovered the universal religion for one world. And of course, the Unitarians were doing similar work in parallel, right? A Unitarian interest in Eastern religions goes back to the Transcendentalists. The Unitarian religious educator Sophia Lyon-Foss was doing truly groundbreaking work in the 50s, bringing in religious education materials from wisdom stories all around the world and from encounters with nature. So the Universalists went a step beyond this even in seeking to cast this as a truly inclusive religious vision for humanity. But creating a new world religion that might unify the religious experiences for all of humanity was a very ambitious undertaking for a denomination that by the 1950s could claim about 40,000 people residing almost entirely in North America. The reality is that Universalism had fallen on hard times, as had its cousin, Unitarianism, which could claim about 100,000 members. Taken together, we were essentially a rounding error. And the idea of the two coming together to join forces had some appeal, The Unitarians and the Universalists had always recognized that there was more uniting them than dividing them. From the very beginning, prominent Universalists were also Unitarians. Prominent Unitarians were also Universalists, even if they didn't always want to admit to that. Ministers were known to move around between the traditions. And in the 20th century, both denominations became more humanist, less Christian, more progressive, more inclusive. There were differences, to be sure, in culture, in traditions, in organization, and in emphasis. The Unitarians were said to be more intellectual, the Universalists more heart-focused. One Universalist complained that the Unitarians were more interested in analyzing the nature of the infinite than in investigating the spirit of love. And he complained further, he felt like he had to put on like his company manners every time he set foot in a Unitarian church. The Universalists were more just us folks. The Universalists were afraid that the Unitarians, who were more numerous and wealthier, would simply swallow them up, and the Universalists would disappear if there was a merger. But over several decades, the idea of merging the two denominations gained interest and momentum, and in the end, the youth led the way. The youth took the first step, and they merged their separate national youth movements into something called the Liberal Religious Youth. And that got the adults going, and shortly after, in 1961, the Unitarian Universalist Association was born out of our separate histories, and this new thing called Unitarian Universalism began. And in the beginning, the Unitarians, with their more humanistic and rationalistic approach, were indeed the dominant partners. Unitarian Universalism initially claimed for itself an identity largely from the Unitarian tradition of reason, freedom, and tolerance. But then a funny thing has happened over the course of our Unitarian Universalist history, over the course of the next 60 years. Increasingly, love, that word, love, is claiming center stage in our understanding of who we are. Now, love is a word that appears nowhere in the seven principles. But increasingly, we are known in the popular imagination as the love people, in part because of those nuclear yellow standing on the side of love t-shirts that we began wearing to protest and acts of social witness during the fight for marriage equality, and later while protesting immigrant detention centers in the Arizona desert. And today, a commitment to a world transformed by love is more and more at the center of who we understand ourselves to be. And we've adopted Dr. King's language of building the beloved community in talking about our religious vision. Now, we are now in the middle of a process to reconsider and reimagine our seven principles for a new generation. We're actually required to reconsider the seven principles at least every 15 years and decide if the language still serves the spirit of our living tradition. Seven principles were never intended to become a creed. This process is being led by a commission called the Article 2 Commission, because technically the seven principles are found in Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. Some traditions have holy books. We have Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. But interestingly, the commission has been charged to do its work holding love as the core UU value that lies behind and unifies all of the other values. They have been asked to hold love as our core theological commitment. That is the lens through which we understand the world and our commitments to it. Not freedom, not reason, not tolerance, but love. If 60 years ago the Universalists were afraid that they were going to be swallowed up by the Unitarians, then today they are having the last laugh. Because it is love, the force that sent those Universalists galloping across the prairie 200 years ago, spreading their radical mission of love and hope, that increasingly lies at the heart of Unitarian Universalism today. We have put our hope in the transforming power of love. We insist, like our Universalist forebears, that every person is worthy of love, that in the world we dream of, the beloved community, no one will be cast out or cast aside. We seek to translate love into liberation for all people. a liberation that breaks people out of all the little hells we create for one another here on earth in our human ignorance, prejudice, and fear, and replace those hells with care, connection, compassion, kindness. Unitarian Universalism is not a creedal religion, and love is not a dogma imposed on us. It is a commitment we are invited to freely make. For our Universalist ancestors, that commitment was seen as an act of gratitude, a natural response to the love of God freely and lavishly given to us, which is given to us not to hoard up in our art, not to hoard up in our own hearts, but to share widely and generously in turn. Today I'm preaching to a Unitarian Universalist congregation of wide theological diversity, so the love of God may or may not be a meaningful theological concept to you, but everyone has some experience of being held by love. So I invite you to pause for a moment. Take a breath. Take two. And reflect on just a few ways that love has acted in your life. Just one or two ways that love has manifested in your life. Reflect on a time when love changed your life. Maybe there was even a time or a way in which love saved your life. Breathe for a moment with your memories of love's power in your life, and think of the people who have loved you into being. And then think of the people who loved them into being. And then think of all the love that comes our way, freely and unbidden, every day. Think of all the ordinary acts of kindness and goodwill, the little acts of love by which we share hope and benevolence with friends and strangers alike. If we exercise our imaginations, we can come to understand that the web of love that holds us is vast indeed, and it stretches back generations. In these days of uncertainty and disorientation, anger and fear, polarization and distrust, I invite you to anchor yourself in love. Make a practice of naming and claiming the love in your life, the love that holds you. And then, as an act of simple gratitude, pass it on. Don't hoard love up in your heart like a scarce commodity. Love freely and lavishly as though love were a universal gift, our birthright. This is our great Universalist tradition that says all of us are worthy of love. All of us are held by love, and all of us can give love, just as we are right now, to a world that badly needs it. May it be so.